So another story from my workplace. It was around Halloween and we were throwing a haunted house. We were working on it throughout the day before we were holding the event, which kept us late into the night. It wasn't so bad, because we had another event that was going late into that evening as well. We finish up about 85% of it before we start going into overtime, which is a big no-no. Luckily, the event that was going on earlier was done, and we were just closing up everything. The bartender comes in to close out her register before realizing what we were doing. We'll call her Mrs. H, who's an old Korean woman who can be a pain in the butt to work with, but we still love her. Her eyesight isn't the best, and she's easily scared, which will come into play later. We give her a tour of the haunted house, which still had moonlight coming in, so it wasn't completely pitch black. The black lights and the window blocking would be done the next day. As we were going through, Mrs. H is holding my manager's hand, we'll call her K, as I trailed behind them. Suddenly, Mrs. H lets out this loud scream. Now, we've startled and scared her before to prank her, but this scream was different. The other screams were surprise from someone jumping out behind a wall to scare her. This one was a lot more intense. She curls up next to Kay, trying to hide behind her as she looks in my direction. "Mrs. H, what's wrong? What happened?" Kay and I both ask. "Someone grabbed my hand," she says, hysterically. I was about 5 feet away from them when we were walking through, within arm's reach, but I would have had to lean in to get to them. Kay and I immediately look at each other and glance around. "Oh no, it was just him playing a joke on you. He didn't mean anything by it," Kay quickly responded. "Yeah, I'm sorry, Mrs. H. I didn't mean to scare you like that," I added. We calmed her down and got her out of the haunted house. As we finished up for the night, we see Mrs. H holding her hand a bit. Kay and I asked to look at it, and it's red like someone grabbed her hand tightly. Mrs. H says it was probably when she snatched her hand away, but I don't think she believed the lie we told her to calm her down. I'm a hospice nurse, and had this experience about 10 years ago when I was a fairly newly qualified nurse and had been at the hospital about 6 months. I was on nights, and after a handover from the late shift, I set off to check in on all the patients, 12 people, with 4 in small private rooms. The private room patients were the closest to death, bedbound and sleeping for long periods. They had no contact with each other. In the first private room, the old lady asked me, "Was that your dog in here earlier, nurse?" I said no and asked about the dog. She told me that it was big and black and like a German Shepherd. I told her that it might have been one of the pets' therapy dogs. I knew one of those was a big black greyhound, but it shouldn't have been roaming off lead, and of course it isn't German Shepherd looking. I checked the visitor log and no therapy dogs had been in that day. I put it down to her pain medication and illness until I went to the second private room and the gentleman said, "There was a big black dog right by my bed earlier." I could see that he was distressed, so I said that it must have belonged to one of the visitors and it had gone now, but a shiver went down my spine. The third room was another lady, very weak, but still quite lucid and coherent. Again, I heard about a black dog. I asked if it looked like a German Shepherd. She said it looked like a wolf. I told her that 2 other patients had seen it, and that seemed to reassure her. I told her that I would be looking into why a visitor's dog had been wandering around, but I knew that there had been no flesh and blood dog on the unit that day. We lost all 3 of those patients within 24 hours. The first 2 were expected and slipped away peacefully. The third lady wasn't expected to go quite so soon. She had a catastrophic bleed that night. In British folklore, a black dog is often associated with death, and was once seen as sort of a spirit guide that led people to the afterlife. It could, of course, have simply been coincidence. Morphine makes people trip. Often they see animals. It's very likely that these people had prior knowledge of black dogs as part of English mythology. But still, all 3 seeing the same apparition on the same evening is pretty creepy and fascinating. It's something I still think about a lot to this day. A couple of weeks ago, I wrote about seeing an old man on the garage roof of my childhood family home in Manchester. After that rather harrowing encounter, I never saw him again. I never dreamt about him again, or even really thought about him. I did have another experience in that same house a couple of years later which frightened me even more. This one stayed with me from the night it happened as a 9-year-old, all the way into adulthood. I still think about it regularly, not just because it genuinely shook me to my core, but also because I wasn't the only one to experience it in the house. As a child, I was very adventurous in my outlook towards fear and thrill-seeking. I'd watch every horror film I could get my hands on. I'd read the scariest novels in my parents' library. I'd throw myself willingly at anything that might have a chance of scaring me. Nothing ever really came close. Once I got into the upper ages of primary school, I started going out with my friends more and staying out later. My parents were very relaxed with my curfew. They knew me well enough to know I'd never put myself in danger or get into trouble, so I was generally allowed to stay out a lot later than the other kids in my group who had to be home around 7 p.m. The park we used to hang around at was further from my house than anyone else's, so I always ended up alone walking home. One night, I impulsively decided to take a different, longer route home that took me past a cemetery. It was the same cemetery that a few of my relatives were buried in, so I was pretty comfortable being there. I stopped to look at the black gates guarding the entrance. They were huge, easily 3 times my height, and were in pretty poor condition. It must have been years since they were painted or had the rust scraped off of them. The gates were covered in moss, and the spikes mounting them had pierced an assortment of odd-colored leaves, and spiderwebs covered the tips of them, with threads connecting each spike. I wanted to go in. I don't know why, but something felt as though it was pulling me in. The gates were barred shut in the evenings, so my only way in was to climb. I eventually talked myself into doing it. I was more worried about someone seeing me do it than any danger that might befall me while I was attempting to get over them. I was a fairly athletic kid, so getting over was no issue, and I was certain I hadn't been seen, even though my weight made the gates rattle loudly and violently. Once I was inside the cemetery, I just walked around, reading the names and ages of the people buried there, taking in when they were born and when they died. Like most cemeteries, the newer plots were at the front, so I started heading deeper to find the older graves. I must have been walking for about 20 minutes when I saw a very unique-looking headstone. It was about 10 feet tall and was shaped like an angel holding a baby with a young child standing beside her. The faces that had been carved into the stone had been weathered away, leaving them featureless. They were eerie to look at in those surroundings, and with the sun having long since set. There was no noise except the rustling of the leaves and the occasional sound of a car driving past the entrance. I knelt at the grave and tried to make out the name on the graves. There were 3, and they'd been dead for a long time. The name at the top of the list, I refused to type it, was clearly the mother given her age. The other 2 were younger. Children. The elder of the 2 had died at the age of 8, while the youngest had only lived for a year. The dates of their deaths were the same. All 3 had passed away at the same time. As a 9-year-old, I understood how odd that was, but not that it could have and likely meant they died in a tragic accident or in a murder-suicide. While I was observing the gravestone, I heard a branch snap in the distance behind me. I immediately jolted around and began scanning to see what caused it. It was tough to see, but I couldn't make anything out. While my back was turned on the grave, the hairs on my neck tingled like someone had blown on them. It was enough to tell me I shouldn't be there and I needed to leave. I ran towards the exit and scaled the gates without worrying how much noise I was making. Once I was over the gates, I began my way home. Occasionally, I'd glance back into the cemetery through the cast iron bars. I was being followed. I was sure of it. The graveyard was pitch black, but I could still make out the silhouette of a person walking alongside me, but much deeper in. I quickened my pace, but the shape kept up, and it now looked closer than before, like it was walking closer toward me, but also still moving sideways. I ran across the road without looking. A car had to slam its brakes to avoid hitting me. The driver beeped her horn and glowered at me. I paid her little attention. I was only thinking about getting home as quickly as possible. I ran the rest of the way. By the time I got home, it was pretty late. My mom told me to get washed up and go straight to bed. I did as I was told. I wanted to put my time in the graveyard behind me and move on to a new day. While I was asleep, I kept dreaming about the cemetery and the silhouette that had moved alongside me. Then I dreamt about the silhouette walking through the streets of my neighborhood and heading straight for my house. In the dream, the silhouette headed straight into my house, up the stairs, and to my room. I woke from the dream and stared at the ceiling. I could see a small amount of light coming through my door. It was ajar. I never slept with my door open, and once shut, it was impossible for the door to open without turning the handle. My room was deathly silent as usual, but I could hear someone walking around in the infinite darkness that was my floor space in my room when the curtains were shut. I peeked through the gap in the railing of my bed and could see the silhouette standing by my wardrobe, thanks to the light coming through the small opening of my door. I shut my eyes and tried to regain my composure. I could hear it moving around. The noise stopped, and the usual silence of the room at night returned briefly. It was broken by the sound of my bunk bed steps groaning under the weight of someone climbing them. I heard the first step, then the second, and then the third. I opened my eyes to look and saw the shape looking back in my direction from the top of the steps. For a second I was transfixed. It wasn't a silhouette anymore, it was a woman wearing a black dress with a veil covering her face. Her face had no features, just like the headstone I'd stopped to look at in the cemetery. Even without eyes, I could tell she was looking at me. I threw the covers over my head and hoped that would be enough to hide from her. It wasn't. I felt her weight shift from the steps onto the bed itself. I felt her edging closer to me. I could feel the weight of her on top of me. It was suffocating, crushing. She moved in the most unnatural way possible, more like a snake than a human. She was shifting up the bed and closer to my face until she stopped. I knew her face and mine were now level. I shut my eyes again and told myself no matter what happened, I would not open them again. My covers were pulled away and I could feel her breath on me. It was odorless and cold, like the breeze that squeezes under a closed door. After what felt like an eternity had passed, I couldn't keep my eyes closed anymore. I opened them and looked at her. She wasn't featureless now. I could see her. I could see her old freckled skin, her pointed nose and thin lips. Her eyes were closed so tightly they looked sealed shut. Only a second had passed before I let out the biggest scream I ever managed in my life. I wanted to wake up every person on my street if possible. The woman slithered away without making a sound, without opening her eyes. I heard my parents' door open and the steps of my bed creaking. My mom and dad burst through my door and flicked my light on. As my eyes struggled to adjust, I could only make out the silhouettes of my parents and the woman. She walked right past them without them noticing. They spent the rest of the night reassuring me that it wasn't real. My dad took me back to my room after I'd started to calm down a bit. I stepped in and saw a muddied footprint on my carpet. I pointed it out to my dad. He could see it too. I could see it on his face. He was uneasy about it. He suggested I stayed in their room. Eventually, I managed to fall back to sleep. The next day, my parents agreed to swap our rooms around. I never experienced anything paranormal in that house again. We moved about 2 years later. I know my dad will have convinced my mom to swap the rooms. I didn't find out why until 3 years ago, when my dad passed away from cancer. On the evening of his funeral, me and my family stayed up talking about our lives together. My mom mentioned what happened that night, and I told everyone who didn't already know the story. When I finished it, my youngest sister, who wasn't alive at the time this happened to me, and my mom shared a look. I asked them what it was for, and my mom told me that my dad had seen something almost identical to my experience. The same woman, the same feeling of her crawling towards him on the bed and just staring at him. He didn't tell me because he didn't want to frighten me more about the whole thing once we'd moved and time had gone by. It was no longer something to even talk about. According to my mom, he'd seen the woman wandering around the house many times after that night. My mom believes in the paranormal but has never experienced anything herself. But she always said me and my dad were very receptive to things like this. The woman has haunted my dreams so many times over the years, and even now, despite the fact I live hundreds of miles from that home, there are times where I feel like she's watching me still. There are times I can see a silhouette on the other side of the road, only when I turn my head, there's nothing or no one there. To this day, I'm convinced that woman haunted my dad and is still doing the same to me. Apologies for the length of this. It's a long story to tell, but I wouldn't feel right not including what happened in the cemetery, as I'm convinced I brought her back with me and into my home.